Sandy Dunn, it is a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for joining the MLSecOps Podcast with myself and Dan McInerney, security threat researcher from Protect AI. Let's start with a little bit about you. Tell us about yourself and how we got here today.
I'm long history in cybersecurity. I've been part of it before we even called it cybersecurity. I got my start in doing digital intelligence, competitive intelligence for HP back in 2001. And no one was really even talking about security. And I dove in and thought, well, if we're sending off these, really multifunction printers were the first IoT devices. And so I thought, well, if we're sending off these, we should care about security. So I dove in. And at the time, there really wasn't a lot of people talking about it. You had to jump onto IRC channels, and there was a couple different podcasts that were out there. So started experimenting, and as I became more knowledgeable, different opportunities became available. I ended up on HP's cybersecurity team. Then became a CISO at Blue Cross of Idaho. I have experience in manufacturing, obviously a CISO in healthcare and a CISO in a startup. So I'm doing security for a really long time.
Across a vast set of experiences, that's wonderful. So that vast set of experiences, your tenure in this industry, obviously, you've been through several digital transformations and several technological domain evolutions, if you will, right? The move to cloud, the move to mobile, Web3. How do you see safety, security, governance of AI applications at this moment in time?
I think, when ChatGPT was first released, I have to admit that I was a little bit numb to the hype cycles. As you said, we've been through so many. And once I started using ChatGPT, I found it to be the most exciting and most terrifying technology that I'd ever seen, and so different than anything that we've seen before. I think the challenge for organizations is this moves them into a very uncomfortable space because this is so different than anything that we've seen before, and trying to manage it with the ways that we've done traditionally just won't be effective. And so helping them understand the bigger landscape, and then being able to find that being uncomfortable enough to know that they're going to probably have to have a larger risk appetite than they've had in the past.
What was the terrifying aspect of that? Like, what made you uncomfortable when you first started using it?
How just what was possible. Like, I quickly identified, all of the different ways, and of course, always thinking about how could this be used against us. Thinking about how quickly an adversary could use these tools to accelerate attacks against an organization that always move more slowly, are bound by processes, that they can now use this. And we had already seen them taking on ransomware as a service, them being able to actually move and be more agile and attack more frequently before we had these type of tools. And then I saw that my black hat isn't very black, and I could come up with 1,000 ways that I could use it to really attack organizations.
So as you thought about the myriad of ways that black hats could be using this technology, you came up with kind of a way to think about it and a way to contextualize and compartmentalize different areas of risks or threats. Talk to us a little bit about that and your framework and how that got the genesis of that.
Yeah, when I was first diving in and trying to understand the different threats, I really came up with initially 4 categories. There was the threats of using the models. So the nuance of that, you actually, because of how you communicate with generative AI, you can't firewall all of the possible ways that it could be attacked. All of the different ways that because the code is actually part of the command, there's no way to actually theoretically, come up with a firewall that always prevents the way that it could be used and manipulated, abused. So that the threats from using the models themselves And then, of course, the threats to the AI models, all of the different ways that you can do the stealing and do the poisoning on the models themselves. Then, of course, the threats from the AI models, which I think is really the most interesting, the AI and regulatory threats. And then lastly, I finally added another category of threats of not using the models. There's the risk of not acting on this and not engaging in using them to improve your environments.
So I love all the work that you've done around LLMs, especially because I can tell that you've thought so deeply about this, like just sitting there late at night pondering, oh my gosh, you could also use it for this. And so how do you see an organization that starts employing, they're at ground zero and they start employing LLMs into their organization? What's like a 10,000 foot view of the first few categories they have to think about in order to help secure their organization after they introduce this into their network or their workflow or whatever?
Well, so one of the questions that occurs to me is the more controls we put in front of it, the less useful it gets. So I could see an organization
Agreed.
saying, hey, we want to use this, making this huge investment, and then trying to lock it down and actually spending a lot of money to create a tool that isn't very useful. So how do we find that balance of this tool that isn't trustworthy? My description of it is a nitroglycerin-filled Tasmanian devil crossed with a cobra. Like it is dangerous, but
sounds delightful.
Yeah.
My kind of pet.
But
where do I go buy one?
But the more you try to contain it and control it, the less effective it is. So how do you find that balance between giving your people access to the tools to be able to use it without trying to block all of the ways that it's effective?
Yeah, I always felt that same way about jailbreaks. Like ChatGPT, for instance, has a bug bounty program, and they don't include jailbreaks in their bug bounty program because that's like it's sort of a gray area of safety, because you can Google most of the bad information that jailbreaks are preventing you from getting. But then you just limit its utility, like a security researcher can't ask it to go find an exploit in this vulnerable code. It can't really, and that's a use of it that helps humanity, You're on the security team. So it's interesting that you bring that up, that all these safety constraints around them end up just nuking their ability to help you get jobs done. So what do you think needs to change in that conventional sense of security going forward? Because I kind of like to think of these changes, like Dee was saying, mobile app security when that was brand new, web applications when those were brand new back in 2000s. Everyone had to kind of tweak their security program. And I'm curious where you think the most useful time is spent for a security team in tweaking their program to include the LLMs in general to protect the organization from the extra threats that these might pose when you start using them.
Yeah, I would say that, first off, you have to understand the business case. I mean, the worst thing you can do is just start throwing LLM or Gen AI technology into your environment without understanding the problem that you're trying to solve. The Gray Noise did a great podcast where they talked about, they identified a business problem. They came up with metrics on how they were going to measure what they were solving with it. And then they could effectively come through and show how using the model actually was a business benefit to them. And I think that's the number one thing, is understanding the problem that you're trying to solve. And you see a lot of people making the mistake of just adding a chatbot, misunderstanding what it's used for, seeing it as more of a way to be a knowledge management system, or misunderstanding what it's useful for, and then applying it to a problem that they probably could solve more effectively a different way, more cost effectively a different way.
Yeah, like that Chevy dealer that ended up using OpenAI's ChatGPT as like a website helper. And then people are like, all right, you are going to make a legally binding agreement with me that you're going to sell me a Chevrolet for $1. Like, now you're just kind of applying the LLM just because you can. And you've opened a security risk without understanding even what you were trying to solve there. Like, are you trying to replace a customer service rep? It's not really what they're best at. And now you've just opened up security issues.
Well, and so positive use cases, threat modeling. I mean, looking at all of those different areas that we know we should be doing that we don't have the time and resources. I think that, and then understanding the risks and benefits. I had a gentleman connect with me today on an AI risk register, which I think is a fantastic idea. I mean, we've never done risk registers well within cybersecurity, and now we have this amazing capability depending on how you implement it and what your metrics are, how you validate that. But now you all of a sudden can move, your program forward heavily or massively.
Yeah, Sandy, you mentioned threat modeling in a recent MLSecOps event this last month had Adam Shostak talking about threat modeling. And, when you think about threat modeling in the context of a business process and a technology that underpins it, if you will, right, and trying to understand both the perimeter of defenses you need to invoke as well as kind of the technological domain nuances or novel attack surfaces that might be there. When you think about threat modeling in that space for business, applied AI, how do you how do you think about guiding your clients and customers and other entities that you are talking with all the time about changing particular elements of their security operations, specifically on that threat modeling element? I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're exactly right. So that's exactly how I recommend approaching it, is understanding what you're not doing well today, and start with the threats. If, all of that technical debt, all of those skeletons that you still have, that everyone knows within the cybersecurity team, the IT team, that you're just waiting for something bad to happen. Now you all of a sudden have a tool that you can actually get ahead of it. If you think through the problem correctly and understand where to apply it, you now have something that you can use to get ahead. And that was part of what I got really excited about when I looked at ChatGPT, because all of that grunt work that we have to do, that takes a lot of resources and time. We now have a tool that can get us ahead of that. So, I would say that to look at the problem holistically. One benefit that ML is really bringing to the conversation is around SBOM. Don't look at LLMs in isolation. Think about the whole business and think about your entire digital ecosystem and saying, what do we do? What are the services that we offer to our customers? And, what aren't we doing well, where LLMs could benefit us to offer a better service? And then based on our attack surface, what does LLMs broaden, and do we need to think about protecting, because we now have this inside and outside of our organization. Also the creativity. The thing that is fascinating to me as I have these different conversations is I think we all use them differently. They're a little bit like a personal assistant, where if I have a personal assistant, maybe I don't want them to get me coffee. Maybe I don't want them to do, plan my flights
Yeah.
because they're terrible at it. But you do, Dee.
Don't do my inbox.
Yeah. And so, everybody's relationship with these will be different, and how we use them to effectively do our work will be different. So I think organizations will benefit from really giving their employees the freedom to understand, hey, how do I apply this to my work so I work better? And I think that's uncomfortable. I mean, I think we're very used to, as an organization, coming up with the technology and then kind of from the top down distributing it. Now we're almost saying, passing it out to our employees and saying, you tell us how we best engage with this.
Hey, I have a follow-up to that, maybe a slight detour. You mentioned the SBOM as a construct, if you will, and a core element of security postures in other spaces. The sponsor of this podcast is Protect AI, and they are a leader in AI ML bill of materials, which is kind of an equivalent to that. How do you think about an AI ML bill of materials in terms of understanding the concepts that you just made, that you just articulated. How vital do you think that is, or important that is, to begin constructing the types of things you're talking about?
I think nutrition labels, however we want to call them, but I think those are critical resources and tools that us as organizational leaders being able to look at those and understanding, hey, what does this system have and what do I need to know about? I mean, things like even bias is such a very complex conversation. I was listening to this Day in AI podcast, and they were talking about one of their users asked for the president of the United States and into Bard, and it popped up a black woman. Well, that's obviously they're overcorrecting in some way that they're so concerned that they're going to be biased one direction, they've almost overtuned the other way. One of the examples I give is I asked Dolly for an image of a university professor, and it gave me a happy person, blonde, attractive, and then I added the word cybersecurity, and she looked like a witch. I mean, that's hidden, so being able to understand all of the different ways that bias can impact, like all
Wow.
of the nuances of what is bias. And I think, I think that's the other interesting thing is we keep throwing around this word intelligence, but we don't even really have a great grasp of what human intelligence is and how we measure and convey what that is. From we've all met that super intelligent person who can't find their way across town. That they don't have common sense, and so how do we measure what is intelligence and what is a correct, interpretation of that? Um,
Right.
what I would, hope organizations recognize is this is truly the jagged frontier. I mean, this is absolutely the very beginning of an exciting technology, but being able to think through it and understand, just how new it is and how much we don't know.
Yeah, I find that there's a lot of gray areas here, like the whole LLM security, because there's the question of bias. You know, in a traditional security metric, something either has remote code execution or it doesn't.
Right.
There's not a lot of gray area. The gray area kind of lies in, well, was it supposed to do remote code execution? Did you protect it well enough? And LLM bias kind of feels like it's riding the edge of this gray area where if you have a bad model and it just categorizes things poorly, but it has a security context, that feels like a vulnerability, something that you could probably label with a CVE or something. But then there's this issue of social biases and stuff like that. And it's like, if you're an organization who's importing, let's say, Llama, an open source model, you don't even control that. You didn't train the model. You're using somebody else's model. And so I feel like this might be a consideration for organizations in how they're kind of doing the threat model itself. There's only so much you can control if you're using open source models. Like, you can't control the safety mechanisms. You can't really control anything like that. So when you're putting these systems together, you're probably going to use an API or some other tool in front of this open source model. And I feel like that's kind of an underrated area of security, is not just all these kind of gray area vulnerabilities in the models themselves, but the tools you stand up in front of them. Do you have any kind of thoughts on the attack surface of this whole ecosystem of tools that have stood up around the open source models and how those might impact all the things you've talked about so far?
Right. And how much of that do you control? Because the reality is for most organizations, they're going to be using a Databricks solution, or they're going to be using an AWS solution. Like, there's this shared responsibility. So we come out with this huge list of potential threats and vulnerabilities, and how much of that do you have visibility or control over? So yes, I agree with you, Dan. I think it's very unknown right now exactly how much you can trust any of it, which, really my response to that is, to go back, but how much can we trust anything? Look at the issues with Avanti this week. So my hope is that we take we look at the entire digital ecosystem and say, hey, we should really have model cards for our Cisco equipment. We should have model cards for everything that we have. So, and then the dynamic part of it, and being comfortable that saying that there's a lot of risk here that I can't control. I don't know. And then being able to monitor and being able to get in front of it quickly.
So what if you were like a new CEO or a CISO of a small organization and they said, we're going to start using Llama 2 and we're going to use this for some sort of business context. And we'll say it's maybe not a super sensitive like business context. It's not filtering spam emails or anything like that. What are like the top 3 things you would tell this organization they have to think about in order to mitigate the worst risks that you see in the AI sphere as a whole?
So it's a great question, and I do think a lot about this, which is there's so many different benchmarks and tools out there, and my guidance would be understanding the business problem that we're trying to solve, putting tests and measurements in place that I can dynamically test, and then going through and monitoring it with those tests consistently. I think that, a little bit like if you're on a battlefield and you're trying to win a war, there's so much that you can't control and you don't know, but you have a mission. And so being able to have that, real-time information on what is the threat and what could possibly have an impact to your organization will be how you move forward effectively using the tools with, not trying to constrain it too much, but being aware that there are a lot of threats.
So let's talk about like practical examples. If you are the CISO of this organization and they put an LLM somewhere in their network, either publicly facing or internally, what do you think would be one of the worst things that could happen to it? I mean, given the examples in, the AI vulnerability database and things of that nature, how do you see, the first breach occurring as the lowest hanging fruit?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't have a great answer. I think anyone who's in the space right now recognizes that it's just a matter of time before there's some huge disaster that none of us anticipated. I think that's what keeps us all kind of, focused on understanding what the threats are. I mean, you look at the models that are out there, they've been shared and everyone's implementing them really quickly. No one really knows their provenance. There could be backdoors. We know adversaries are actively always trying, even on GitHub, they're always trying to sneak in different ways that they can compromise systems. And I think right now, Dan, it's just an unknown. So, part of that is just segmentation and making sure that you're not letting it impact, knowing, putting the LLM into a place where it is in production, but you're isolating it from the things that would absolutely devastate your business.
Yeah. And so I was thinking about this because you just mentioned you think that there's probably going to be some kind of event in the future that's probably going to be pretty catastrophic that has something to do with AI security. And we don't know the unknown unknowns, of course, in this case. But I was thinking about this a lot too. And we actually spoke about this recently about how we both kind of feel like the whole agency thing with LLMs is really going to blow the door open on the practical security concerns of deploying an LLM in production. So for those that don't know, agency in LLM kind of means you allow the LLM to make commands on your behalf. You allow it to make, system commands, stand up a web server, write some code and deliver it to GitHub. That kind of thing is terrifying to me. And I have the feeling that you may agree with me on that. Did you want to talk a little bit about how agency kind of changes everything? That's probably coming in the next year or two. I know OpenAI is working on it right now.
Yeah, the agency, I'm confused on why anyone would trust an LLM with agency, because my personal experience is I'll ask it to do something. I did this recently. I asked it to identify, I had a weed in some hay, and I took a picture of it, uploaded it to ChatGPT and said, what is this? And it was able to answer the question identified the weed, told me exactly what it was. 2 days later, I took the same picture, asked it again because I was going to add it to some slides, and it said, sorry, I can't help you. I can't help you with that. I don't know, and so it failed. And that happens.
It didn't have its coffee, Sandy. Didn't have its coffee.
So,
Early morning,
or that experience
time
where
of day.
you ask it to do something and it refuses, and you say, yes, you can do this, do it now. And then it says, oh yeah, okay, I can do it. So, like it's so tricky to engage with it. For me personally, and I don't consider myself an expert prompter. It fails so frequently. I would never hand it a task that was mission critical because I just don't trust it.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Like right now, I feel like the agency aspect of these is really scary because it gets the code wrong. I ask it to write code all the time, and about 30 to 50% of the time, there's a bug in the code somewhere. And yet, there's these tools like AutoGPT that came out fairly recently, I guess,
No, over a
and
year
it's got
ago. I
100,000
played with it,
a year
Dan.
ago.
Yeah,
Really,
I played with it, and
really.
yeah, and spent a couple days getting it all stood up because I thought, oh, this is the answer, and then found it failed all the time. Now that was a year ago, so I'm sure they've improved it since then. But I've consistently found that problem personally that when I ask it to do something, my answers are incorrect. So I agree with you that I think agency is something that and obviously everyone has their different prompts that they use that to improve the quality, but I myself have not been able to have success with it.
Hmm.
Yeah, I haven't either. So one thing I've been thinking about, like kind of the parallel here, is whenever MacBooks started doing facial recognition, or not MacBooks, iPhones started doing facial recognition. I remember all my friends, all my hacker buddies are all like losing their minds. They're like, I'm never getting an iPhone. And then here we are several years later, and they all have an iPhone and they're using facial recognition. And they're like, well, the convenience just kind of overweighs my security concern. And I
Yeah.
feel like we're going down that path on the LLMs because they want the convenience. And even if it fails today, in probably a year or so, there'll be tools that kind of figure out what it's good at and what it's bad at to give it that agency. And I feel like that is when the attack surface blows up. That attack surface starts going from data leakage to remote code execution through the prompt itself into the model. And so these things are gaining power like exponentially every day. So I completely agree that these unknown unknowns in the future risks of these is probably a lot more significant than the current risks that we can think of. The data leakage, the model theft, that sort of thing. Those still feel slightly theoretical. Did you have any thoughts on like the theoretical attacks like the model theft versus a practical attack like prompt injection and LLMs, and where kind of companies should be focused on defending in those situations?
Yeah, yes, I completely agree with you. A lot of the actual machine learning model attacks, some of the poisoning attacks and the different things that they come up with do feel a little bit like, as in, thinking about attackers, I mean, they're always, the end game 95% of the time is money. And they're going to do whatever they can to access, impact you financially. And if it takes a lot of effort, they're not going to do it. But, as we close down and we mitigate against those kind of threats, those ones that seem theoretical all of a sudden become attractive to attackers. So I don't think we can ignore them in the long term, but the short term, I think that um, you we need to really put on that black hat and think about how an attacker will want to impact our organization and the low hanging fruit right now, which is absolutely just tricking end users into doing something really stupid. We see the phishing attacks, last year, QR codes
Yeah.
that were used effectively in phishing attacks because our our email filtering systems weren't prepared for QR codes as a method of attack. So I think that we have to really put on that black hat and think about, how attackers will want to use this, and focus on the most likely attacks and maybe ignore the noise, the research noise around the theoretical attacks.
Yeah. Slight detour here into what you were talking about with the phishing attacks. So we've been talking about how to like kind of defend your own LLMs, but you had mentioned at the beginning about how you think deeply also about how attackers can use LLMs to change the landscape of the threat field for general security of an organization. And I remember I have an example here of how that's actually happening right now is one of my buddies was on a pen test, and he was supposed to reset a password for a user so he could get access to the network. And he put on a wig, got a couple photos. I think he literally only got 2 pictures of an employee and used a deepfake software to impose her face onto his face. He prints off a fake ID at Kinko's and he calls up Help Desk. And Help Desk had a policy where you can put up your ID to the camera and you can show your face and you can say, I request a password reset. And they'll just reset your password. And it worked. He used the deepfake technology to reset his password. And I see this probably happening a lot more. So when we're talking about organizations that are employing LLMs, you don't have to just think about securing your LLM. You have to think about your holistic security as to how you defend against things like deepfakes and reach and change, your password reset policies, for instance, or your phishing emails, because LLMs are fantastic at writing phishing emails. Did you have any other kind of thoughts on how attackers might use LLMs to attack an organization? Whether they use AI or not.
Well, to your point, Dan, which is one of the interesting outcomes that we're seeing with the deep fakes is attackers actually taking actual information and saying that it's a deep fake. So creating churn and noise by not only creating deep fakes, but making people question whether real information is accurate. So we're at a point right now where really the internet, you absolutely, it's never been more untrustworthy than has been right now. But one of the fascinating and positive outcomes I see is what I see in many of the AI groups that I'm part of is we now have circled around to where we're connecting with the human. We're actually distrusting. There's so much noise, so much information that I'm reaching out and I'm saying, oh, I trust Dan. I've seen what Dan produces. I've watched his YouTubes. He's credible to me. I'm going to trust what he says. So we're now seeing where my personal experience is that we're actually, putting more emphasis on that human connection than on the digital connection.
Yeah. You were talking about use of Gen AI in both kind of a professional context and then kind of like what I would call out of band use, right? Where somebody's going to use the tool. It reminds me of how, back in the day, everybody tries to block social media in their enterprises. That did not work, right? And I think it goes back to a comment that Dan made where utility trumps all.
Yes.
So knowing that utility is available and knowing that there is a spectrum of entrepreneurs, business owners, directors, managers that are listening to this podcast, what are recommendations you have for businesses whose employees might be using Gen AI today in the workplace, but the company itself has no formal policies in place? Like, what are some of the approaches that those businesses can take to build an AI security strategy, considering they're starting from scratch? And I mean, isn't that kind of how your proposed OWASP LLM AI security and governance checklist that you've been working on kind of comes into play? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say that just like you've mentioned, Dan, I think blocking or trying to prevent it as an organization, you create a bigger problem than you solve. So as a CISO, I always made a huge effort to build a relationship with my DevSec team, my DevOps team, because I always felt like the worst thing is if they're trying to hide something from me and I get surprised by it. Like, I'd much rather make sure that they brought issues to me so I could get in front of it. And so my response to that as an organization, I think that you have to make sure that you have policies, educate, explain to people what bad, the negative, if they use these incorrectly, they impact the organization, but give them the space to be able to use the tools because they are going to. They have it on their phone. There's so many different applications that are out there that it's impossible to block. But give them the freedom, and then of course monitor. I mean, trust, but you still have that responsibility to look for those rogue people who are using it in a negative way or something. But finding that balance between bringing it into the organization, but also encouraging. I mean, your employees are the ones that are going to help you with the use cases. They're down in the trenches knowing the work that's slowing them down and where Gen A could actually help them. So I think trusting and building together as an organization will move the organization faster, more quickly. Putting those guardrails in place, making sure that you're doing it responsibly, but trusting them to do it, to use the tools.
And we'll put in a link on the show notes, obviously, for your incredible. It's worth a read. Everybody should take a look at it. The kind of proposed OWASP LLM AI security and governance checklist. It's a really cool framework. And I guess that brings me to, as we kind of think about closing out here, a call to action, right, for the listeners of the MLSecOps audience, which includes practitioners, managers, developers, pen testers, hackers, and just interested parties generally. One of the things that we talked about early on was that you kind of described this almost as asymmetrical warfare, right? And that we needed to start thinking and acting cohesively and collectively. From your perspective, in this asymmetrical theater of attack possibilities and potentials and defenses, what is the call to action that you would want this MLSecOps audience to take to try to advance the capabilities and advance the defenses and advance the mitigations of these coming AI attacks and AI risks?
Yeah, I see this as an opportunity. We're at a tipping point. I mean, the internet was really an experiment that got loose quickly. It's always advanced quickly. Security has always been an afterthought. The impact to people from, even from a mental, we're seeing our children that are impacted negatively from all of the social media and comparing themselves. I think we're at a point now, this is so serious and the impacts can be so devastating in both, but there's also, a ton of positive potential too, where we reestablish our relationship with technology in general and come up with, how do we use this, effectively so that it benefits our organization and benefits us all as people, as we move into this new frontier, this jagged frontier. I think this is a tipping point from kind of a relationship that has moved quickly, not always in a good direction. And now we get a chance to really use these tools to reestablish, how does it serve us and not us serve it?
Right. We're kind of at that peak Gartner hype cycle right now, where the utility is slowly not meeting our expectations, but we're only a couple years away from these things just taking off like a rocket ship and, either taking jobs or hopefully benefiting humanity by getting rid of things that we don't want to do already.
Yeah,
and creating value.
But Dan, even as, look at our kids in schools. They're bored to death. They're not inspired. It's the same, stuff over and over again. And people talk about, the fact that kids can't communicate and they're not interested. Well, that's a problem that we created as a society. Now we have a tool where we can customize and create an education system that's unique for every student, that they get challenged every day and they're excited to come in. I love learning. How come kids don't love learning? Let's understand that and try to inspire them about what's possible. So I think there's. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm so glad
unless it's consumed via an iPad, right? My 9-year-old, IPAD, the most 4 dangerous letters in my household.
Yeah, because we didn't get to talk about education here, but man, I have found ChatGPT to be the greatest tutor on earth. It teaches me about everything I wanted to know. It's like my fountain of curiosity. It can't be large enough. There's nothing I can't go investigate using ChatGPT. So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to implementing an education specifically so that we can let kids go down these crazy paths to learn about all the dinosaurs they could ever wish to know that their parents may not know about. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily see that happening in the education field right now. I see a lot of, my uncle is a professor at a major university, and he was asking me, well, how do I detect plagiarism from ChatGPT? I'm like, man, I mean, you got a couple tools you can use, But these things are evolving so fast. I mean, ChatGPT is updating every couple months. What's the point? Try integrating this into your curriculum. Stop trying to fight it off.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of also the same thing that we should be sending to security people. You don't necessarily have to worry all the time about LLMs. You can use LLMs to help secure your infrastructure too. Hey, write me a checklist of things I have to change if I implement an AI engineering department. Type that into GPT. I'm sure it'll give you some good ideas.
Well, just think about character AI. Instead of having kids learn about Joan of Arc in a book, now all of a sudden they can talk with her and say, what motivated you? Now all of a sudden they're having an engagement with a historical figure. Napoleon Bonaparte, teach me about leadership. What are the three critical things? And again, but there's a negative side to it too. The AI girlfriends that people, it's a very difficult. It's a fine line between disaster and success with AI, and I think that's the thing that is the most interesting and also the most terrifying.
Well, to end on education and learning, I want to thank you, Sandy, for joining the MLSecOps podcast here. We really appreciate your leadership, your ability to weave LLMs and other tools into the education of this field of MLSecOps. So I want to thank you for coming on today and for all of the work. And for everybody else, make sure you check out the show notes. Go have a look at the proposed OWASP LLM AI security and governance checklist from Sandy. It's a wonderful read, and I'm sure commentary would be amazing. You can find Sandy in our MLSecOps Slack channel, where she is very active and guiding a whole lot of people in how to think about this stuff. And once again, Sandy, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you to Dan, my co-host, for today.